Okay, we are up to chapter 20, which once again is discussing the perspectives that Shabbos gives us to take with us for the rest of the week. And this one is called God is Close. So he begins the following. What does it mean that God rested on the seventh day of creation? Right? I mean, we all know that that is the reason why we have Shabbos. We say that in Kiddush on Friday night. The Psukim say it as well. Here I've got this. Vayivarech Elokim es yom hashvi'i. God blessed the seventh day. Vayikadesh, so sanctified it kivo shavas mikol malachto, because on that day he rested from all of his work. And the obvious question really is, what does it mean that God rested? It is inconceivable, he continues, that God requires rest. And is it even possible that God ceased creating at the end of the first week of creation and on every Shabbos since then? This would seem to contradict what we say in our morning prayers, that the Creator in his goodness renews each day constantly the work of creation. We say in our Shacharis morning prayers, we say, Amachadesh b'tuvoi, the one who renews in his goodness, b'chol yom tomid, every day constantly, ma'aseh bereshis. Which means, he continues, that without his constant creative energy, the universe would cease to exist. So therefore, there's really two questions here the Chief Rabbi is asking. The first question is, very simply, what does it mean that God rested? Right? When a human being builds something, he works very hard for 6 days, the person then requires to rest. But what does it mean that God rested? God doesn't get tired. God wasn't physically creating that he should get tired, and obviously is infinite and cannot get tired. So therefore, what does it mean that God requires rest? Question number two he's asking is a little bit deeper, which is that surely there's an idea that God is continuously creating the world. We know that God didn't just leave the world after he created it to its own devices, but rather God is continuously willing it into existence and, as it were, renewing each day his work of creation. And therefore, his second question is, how can we say that God rested, which would seem to be that he ceased creating on Shabbos, if we say at the same time in our morning tefillahs, in our morning prayers, that he renews his work of creation every single day? Those are the two questions. Now, just before we go to the answer the Chief Rabbi gives, there are a few interesting perspectives I wanted to bring to your attention on this, because it is dealt with by all of the classic commentaries on the Chumash. And he says the following, this is the Or HaChaim. Or HaChaim says the following thing. This is the way that creation works, a fascinating thing. And he says the following. Hashem, he says, revealed in the Ten Commandments that each week the world is created for only 6 days. And he says what Shabbos does essentially is it then infuses into the world another 6 days of being, another 6 days of existence. And he says, he reads the pasuk in the Aseret HaDibros, Ki sheishes yomim osa Hashem es hashamayim ve'es haaretz. For God created the world to last for 6 days. And he says that therefore, that seventh day that God created was to put the nefesh, as we've mentioned before, to give the world its soul, and therefore the creation really almost renews itself every single week, according to him, because you have the 6 days for which the world was created, then the seventh day, which gives the world another 6 days, and then again the whole cycle continuously repeats itself. So according to the Or HaChaim, it would seem to be that there is no cessation really on Shabbos, except for the fact that God is now giving or infusing the world its spiritual component. And then what that does is it renews creation for another 6 days each time. So 6 days, and then another 6 days, and then another 6 days. And therefore God resting is really, it means that it's the only time he stopped creating. Because otherwise, during the rest of the time, God is continuously, each week, is creating it from new. Another approach is that there's a very big difference between creating what's called yesh me'ayin, which means creating something from nothing, or creating something from something. Meaning, during the 6 days of creation, God does the once only creation of something from nothing, where there is at the beginning, the very beginning at least, there is nothing at all. And from that nothingness, God creates matter. So that's what happens during the 6 days of creation. Everything that happens after that is only bringing out the potential that already existed in the physical world, or yesh miyesh, which means taking something which already exists and then forming and changing, manipulating into other things. But so therefore, those 6 days of creation are the time when God creates something from nothing. God rested from creating something from nothing. And therefore, yes, God is continuously renewing the world, but not creating something from nothing. So those are two different perspectives on how I can understand God created and then rested, and the world sort of continues to exist after that. Either it's, like the Orach Chaim says, it's recreated every Shabbos in order that it should have another 6 days of existence, or alternatively, it's a creation which is yesh miyesh, meaning it's something which is already there, which is now manipulated, changed according to the laws of nature, and formed in order to continue to exist. But there's no longer creation of something from nothing. That only happens during the first 6 days. These are a couple of approaches. Rabbi Goldstein goes with a very sort of a mystical approach, which is a fascinating idea. He continues in the second paragraph. The answers to these questions, he says, can be found in a deeper perspective of how God engages with this world. We use human terms to describe the divine, even though he is beyond such descriptions, so that we have a way of relating to God. Okay, the Torah itself describes this. We just read the Shira, the song that Jewish people that they sing when they are at the splitting of the sea, just after the splitting of the sea. And over there, it describes God's strong hand, describes how God has a mighty, strong hand. And of course, it doesn't really have a strong hand, but rather it's telling it in terms that we can understand. With that caveat, he continues, we can think of God's creative interaction with the universe in 3 ways: thought, speech, and action. So obviously, God is not really doing any of these, if you like, but rather we can understand that there are 3 different types of ways that God interacts with the world: with machshava, with dibur, with ma'aseh, thought, speech, and action. During the 6 days of creation, God brought the world into being with speech and action. Right? In fact, we know there were 10 utterances, 10 sayings with which God created the world. On the 7th day, when it says that God rested, it means that he ceased creating and sustaining the universe through speech and action, and instead created and sustained our world solely through his thought. An interesting idea, meaning the chief rabbis answered, his original question was, what does it mean that God rested? Surely God doesn't need to rest. And the answer is, it's true. He didn't really rest completely. He rested from creating with speech, from creating with action. And now he changed or switched to a mode of creating just using thought. The second question is that we ask, every single day in davening, we say God is continuously renewing the world every day. And the answer is yes, but it works in a different way, because on Shabbos, he's renewing it only in thought. Now, this is going to have a consequence in terms of the way that God is actually connecting to the world. He continues, of course, there is nothing more essential to creativity than thought. On Shabbos, God continues to sustain the world through his creative energy, but does so with the closest form of that energy to himself, his power of thought. It's an interesting thing. If we think about it conceptually, the thoughts that we have are actually what's closest to our innermost essence. Because action, if you like, is the furthest away from ourself. Once we already have it, something which is in the material, physical world, that is outside of ourself that we do with action. And then you have a speech, and even the speech is something which is already, it's left my mouth, it's already left my body. And therefore that is also outside of ourself. Whereas our thoughts literally are still within us. They're our very essence. In fact, in Bereshis it says, Vayeda Adam es Chava Ishto, that Adam knew his wife Eve, and Rashi says that means that they had a child, because the closest form of intimacy is described with the word of das, with the word of knowledge, because true knowledge is the closest thing you can possibly have to yourself, to your own inner essence. And therefore he says that on Shabbos, it's the closest form of energy to himself, the thought of God, as it were. Going over the page, on Shabbos, all of the worlds are elevated. God draws closer to the world through the intimacy of his thinking, thereby infusing creation with divine energy, holiness, and light. Meaning it's now also has a ramification on the creation, because since God is creating the world with thought, so therefore it's a more elevated world. It's infused with more of that divine light on Shabbos than it is the rest of the 6 days. Now he continues that we do the same thing as well. We pattern our behavior on God's own engagement with the world. Like the divine, when we rest on Shabbos, we enter the sacred world of thought. We devote our minds to the rarefied world of Torah study. We feel an intimate sense of closeness with God on Shabbos as we return to our source. It's an interesting thing because on Shabbos, we refrain from action and from speech in many different areas, right? Certainly, as we spoke about the 39 categories of forbidden work, those are all the types of creative work that we can't do. Certainly, those are things which are outside of ourselves. We can't action those things which we would normally be able to do during the week. Anything from writing something down to cooking food as we normally would do, to building things, all of those things we don't do. We even desist from speaking about certain things. A lot of people aren't aware we're not allowed to speak about our business. So if there is someone at the Shabbos table and they're interested in buying something, we've got it to sell, we're not allowed to even talk about it on Shabbos, because that also falls under the prohibition of a type of work. So therefore we stop certain areas, at least, of our action and our speech, which leaves us with our thoughts, which leaves us in the same way that God interacts with the world with thought. So similarly, us on Shabbos as well, we interact with the world with thought. He continues, page 96, the root of the word Shabbos is related to the word return, right? Shev is to return, shav, and teshuvah, they all mean return. So Shabbos actually comes from that root. On Shabbos, the entire universe returns to its source. Before creation, there was only God and the world of thought. In creating the universe, God transformed the world of thought into a world of speech and action. On Shabbos, when God's powers of creativity return to the level of thought, the universe returns to its divine pre-Genesis essence. Fascinating idea to think about, right? Because before the world is created, there's nothing which has been brought into the world of action, and therefore it's all in the realm of thought, and it returns to that every single Shabbos. It echoes a little bit the idea that we said that the world is being recreated as well, because it's almost coming back to what it was earlier before it existed in a material sense. He continues, that is why, according to the Medrash, Shabbos is also a day of repentance, which is about returning to our godly essence. On Shabbos, like the universe, we return to our source, aided by our ability to reconnect with an extra dimension of our soul, as we spoke about that extra level, the Neshama Yisera. This reflects the deep spiritual parallel between how God interacts with the universe and the soul interacts with the body. Shabbos is the day of the world returning to God and the body returning to the soul. So in the same way that there's God and the rest and the world, really, God is, if you like, the soul of the world. So the world returns to God. So similarly, we're a little microcosm of that. And our body returns to the soul. That's the higher level of the soul, the elevated soul. And he ends off on Shabbos, God is closer to us and the universe than at any other time in the week. We feel God's presence more immediately, and we reaffirm and refocus on our essential spiritual self, our own inner reflection of the divine. On Shabbos, the universe returns to its divine source and is transformed, and so are we. You know, I feel sometimes when you're there on Shabbos, it could be a moment in shul, it could be maybe at home, sitting at the Shabbos table, it could be when one's lighting the candles. Sometimes there are moments where one can really sense something. Those are moments, but they're moments that we need to grab onto, because those moments could be the time when our soul and our neshama is actually sort of really sensing the fact that it's much more connected than it is the rest of the week. Those are the times when really we've got that intimate knowledge, as we spoke about, we've got the intimate knowledge of the spirituality. So on Shabbos, the perspective here that we've discussed is the fact that God is close. God is closer because it's a different mode of creation. It's a creation of the world and sustaining the world, which comes from God's thought, God's mind, as it were, his inner essence itself. And because of that closeness that God has to the world, therefore that brings us in turn closer to him, closer to the spirituality, the neshama that is inside of us as well. And there are moments during Shabbos when we can maybe sense that as something to sort of appreciate and to grab onto as well. That completes chapter 20.